Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to class this afternoon. This week we are getting started with the introduction to Bootstrap. So we're going to start working with Bootstrap this week. We're done for the time being with jQuery, although we might be revisiting it a little later on as we progress. We might even revisit it a little bit next week and just do some kind of website where we combine multiple of the tools that we've learned into one website kind of demonstration. So we'll do a website that has, or that's responsive, that uses both Bootstrap and jQuery to make a neat little website for us. So maybe that's what we'll do for our demonstration next week. But Bootstrap is a two-part or a 2-week module. We have part 1 this week. We'll have part 2 next week. And we'll be looking at different things each week. This week we're just kind of introducing the idea of Bootstrap, and then next week we'll be deep diving into different parts of Bootstrap. So I've got a few slides that I want to show you here today, and then we'll just do a little brief demonstration. And we'll go ahead and wrap things up for today. But before we get into the content, just a couple of announcements. One is that, again, I'm reminding you that I will be in touch with you within the next week or so. For those of you who haven't heard this yet, I think everybody in here is in at least one other of my courses. So you'll have heard this in one of the other ones, but I will be getting in touch with all of you within the next week or so, just to kind of touch base, make sure we're in a good spot. As we're heading into the second half of the semester, as we're heading into really the end of the fall semester and going into the spring semester, I just want to make sure that we're all feeling okay about things, that we're all we all have a kind of a plan and an understanding of what needs to be done for the spring and all this kind of fun stuff. So that's what we'll do as we push onward there. And if you have any questions about anything, whether it's related to this course or not, you all know how to contact me. You can contact me via email or via Microsoft Teams, and we will do our best to figure things out. But we're introducing Bootstrap today. And in terms of a web development tool, this is a pretty big one, right? And there are many things out there like Bootstrap nowadays. One of the things that I might want to do for a future version of this course is incorporating many different types of frameworks, which is what Bootstrap is. Bootstrap is a framework. Incorporate many different types of these HTML and CSS frameworks into the course, just because there are so many of them nowadays, right? Like we have Bootstrap and Tailwind and some others that their names are escaping me right now. Like I was just looking at one this morning and its name is already escaping me. But there are tons of these out there. And so really when we're looking at Bootstrap, as we've said, what it is it is a framework. And in particular, it's a front-end framework. So it deals with HTML and CSS. And it's a front-end framework that allows us to build websites more quickly and easily. Right, so it's this front-end framework. It's free to use. It's open source. And the goal here is to just have faster, easier web development. Right, like you want something that looks attractive. You want something that looks nice as you're making prototypes and working on different things. But especially if your prototype that you're making is highly technical, right? Like you're writing a lot of back-end code or you're writing a lot of JavaScript to kind of make something work. You don't have that much time to make it look nice. And when things look nice, it always does better in presentation. So if you want something to look nice, but you don't have a lot of time to put into making it look nice, well, that's one of the big reasons why we use Bootstrap. Right? We can, with one line of code, we can take a website that doesn't look very nice, and we can make it look pretty nice. We can, it looks kind of generic, but it looks clean and readable and, just nice in general. Another thing that we can use here is that they've taken the grid system, right? Some of you might be familiar with CSS Grid. and Flexbox that we've talked about in other courses. It takes that grid system for Flexbox and it standardizes it into its own thing that makes it a lot easier to use. So as you're like laying out pages, one of the things to do there is that you can use that Bootstrap grid to quickly establish a layout. Like I had to build, I've done that before, right? Like I had to build a site extremely quickly. And I'm like, well, I don't want to try to figure out the grid myself. I want to do this quickly and easily. So I imported Bootstrap just for the use of the Bootstrap grid in this particular project. Just because it does simplify the idea of the grid down that much. I think that's in our presentation for next time to talk about the Bootstrap grid. But the primary focus for Bootstrap is HTML and CSS. And it deals with things like your typography, your buttons, your forms, your tables, navigation, all this other sort of stuff that you're dealing with. Right? And you also have optional JavaScript plugins that you can use with Bootstrap that kind of works with it. One of the big reasons why we taught jQuery and why we taught jQuery before we taught Bootstrap in the past, now it's just kind of a historical way we've done it. Well, one of the reasons why we taught jQuery before we taught Bootstrap in the past is that prior to version 5, which is the current version, prior to version 5, all of Bootstrap's JavaScript libraries were built in jQuery. So you would need an understanding of jQuery to figure out how to work Bootstrap's JavaScript libraries. However, with the implementation of Bootstrap 5, one of the things they did there, as we've kind of mentioned in lessons previously, jQuery is kind of going out of style. It's kind of out of fashion in terms of popular use, even though it's still implemented in a lot of different projects. We talked about that too. Millions of projects, millions of websites still use jQuery, so we should learn it. But they took it, they stripped out all the jQuery, and they replaced it with regular vanilla JavaScript. So now vanilla JavaScript is a little more important to know as we're going into Bootstrap, but that's not a tool per se, it's a language. So we learn that in other courses like Web 2.15, which most of you, if not all of you, are currently in. Now, another thing here that is a big deal for Bootstrap is it allows you to create responsive designs, because Bootstrap by default utilizes responsive units. Right, so once we apply Bootstrap to a website, it's going to automatically use responsive units to help make your website responsive. So that's another thing that it gets you up and running with quickly and easily. Right, you don't have to worry about all those dynamic units to make the site responsive. You can just include Bootstrap and problem solved. In this case, what we're doing here, this is why we consider Bootstrap a tool, just because it is, this, as we'll see kind of today, it is this one line of code where we start that takes our website from something that, is generic, is standard, and pushes it into something that looks nicer, that can work on a grid system, and that is responsive immediately with one line of code. Right, so that's a pretty big deal. A little bit about the history of Bootstrap. Bootstrap was actually originally called Twitter Bootstrap, right, because it was originally built as a framework for the Twitter web platform. Right, so it was developed by Mark Otto and Jacob Thornton at Twitter. And it was released as an open source product in August 2011 on GitHub. So it's been around for a decade now in the public, right? Bootstrap has been around for a decade now in the public. And people have been building websites with it ever since. We see some examples here of the advantages of Bootstrap. It's easy to use. Its responsiveness. It utilizes a mobile first sort of style, so it starts with that mobile style sheet, and that started really in Bootstrap 4 to have that mobile first sort of focus. And it's compatible with all modern browsers. Everything that you use, right? It has all the considerations for all the browser idiosyncrasies that we've encountered in the past. And so it's a great thing for us to use, because we don't have to worry about, well, do we need to use WebKit? Do we need to use Moz? Do we need to use any of these weird prefixes? With Bootstrap, it's already thought of all that for us. In those places where we would need that, it already has that present. So it's super easy to use. So I guess the next question that would be on our minds is, well, where do we get it? Where do we get it? And just like with jQuery, we can download it ourselves. So we can download Bootstrap and host it ourselves from the getbootstrap.com website, which is the official home of Bootstrap, getbootstrap.com. And it actually gives you instructions there about how to install it and how to use it. Or we can include Bootstrap from a CDN, just like we were doing with jQuery. So these are both options for how we can use Bootstrap in our projects. And so I've got getbootstrap.com. I've got the website here pulled up, so let me just find the window that has that in it. Too many windows open. Here's getbootstrap.com. And so this is the home page. This is what you get to when you go to getbootstrap.com. So a couple things to point out here. One is that this is the home of the documentation guide as well. So when we click up here at the top, we see docs. These are all of our documentation guides for Bootstrap, and this will be kind of what we go through as we're talking about some of the different components and working with some of the different components. But here we can see, like, it has information about the accessibility of Bootstrap and how we can work with that in this getting started section. And in all these other sections, it contains information about how to customize different products, customize the CSS variables, customize various things. And then we get into our CSS properties with our layouts, with our content, with our forms, with our components, all these odds and ends. All sorts of stuff that we can do here. And we'll be going through this more so next week and just looking at all the different components and all the different parts. For this week, we're just getting started. So we're back on the getbootstrap.com homepage here. We see we have a download button here in the upper right-hand corner. And that takes us to the download page. Right, and from here, we can download our source files, or we can get our links to our CDNs. Right, everything is right here for us. Right, so we can download everything right here in our with this download button. We can download the precompiled CSS and JavaScript. It'll download for us as a zip file. We can unzip that, and we can put those files in our project folder. So let's do that. And this will give us the ability to kind of look at what's in these files as well. So I've got my pzip open on another screen so I can unzip these. Here's what we end up with. Let's see here. Let's try that again. That's better. So once we unzip the file, we see we have a Bootstrap -5.1-3-dist. And when we open that up, we see we have our CSS files, which we have a bunch of them. And we have our JavaScript files. Right, so I'm going to pull this folder into my project file here. This Bootstrap folder, just so we can see it. We'll copy this. And we'll put it in the project file that we have for VS Code. Like so. Now if we open up VS Code, we have that folder inside of our project folder. And we can look at the CSS and we can look at everything that we have in relation to all of this. So we see all of the CSS files here. And there's a bunch of CSS files for various things. Several of these are called for different aspects of the code, right? So we can call part or all of our code. If we want to use everything, we have this bootstrap.css file here. And that is everything kind of loaded in here and everything imported from all of the other style sheets and everything. So this is our entire Bootstrap style sheet. And so as we scroll through here, we see it's a huge style sheet here in this Bootstrap CSS sheet. And the Bootstrap that we see here is the compiled version of the CSS. Now, when we say compiled here, this means that it's just a regular CSS file that we can work with on our sites. In this case, Bootstrap at the source is a Sass document. And we'll talk about Sass a little bit later on in the course. We have the whole module that's dedicated to CSS preprocessors, and that's what Sass is. Sass is a CSS preprocessor. But you can see that we have a bunch of colors here that have been predefined as variables. We have a bunch of fonts here that are going to be used and are already in our workspace defined as fonts. We have the box sizing border box already set for us. You know, we've got a lot of stuff here. We've got a lot of stuff already set here for us. We've got media query rules here for scalability purposes, responsiveness purposes. All sorts of stuff available to us here. We also have the minified version of that, which is the version of that code which is kind of compressed. We see it here. We typically will use the long versions in development and the minified version in production, right? So there's that. Let's look at some of the JavaScript. I was going to say jQuery files, but they're just regular old JavaScript files. By default, we get the Bootstrap bundle here. These are all the scripts. You can just have a look at the JavaScript here. You can see that they're using arrow function notation. For these JavaScript functions. And all sorts of stuff here for us to use. We'll talk more about some of these JavaScript plugins that are included by default next time. So I wanted to show you this download, but I don't really want to use this download, right? Like, that's a little too difficult for us. You know, we don't need to do that, right? Because it's just like we were dealing with when we were dealing with jQuery. We have this CDN available to us. It's much easier to use the CDN. And these files are already cached in a lot of people's browsers. So we don't have to worry about re-downloading them again, saving us some efficiency there. So if we look here, we have our CDN via JS Deliver. That's a part of this download page where we click that download button, and we just came down and we found these CDN via JS Deliver. All we have to do is click copy to copy that to the clipboard. And we'll paste that in the head of our site, but we'll do that in just a minute. What I'd like to do is I'd like to put a little bit of content on here first. So we can kind of see the big changes that Bootstrap makes just by including the CDN in the head of our skeleton. So I've got a JavaScript skeleton here. I'm just going to add Some content areas, we'll add a header here. We'll add a main. And I'm not going to style anything personally yet. Right, we'll save that for later. But we'll add a footer here. In our header, we'll have an H1. Welcome to our website. In our main, we'll add an H2. Thanks for stopping by. And then let's just add like a paragraph of text here. I'm going to have to recopy that CDN link, right? Because I want to get some dummy text from randomtextgenerator.com. Let's use a different language today. Let's throw in some, I don't know, Portuguese. Why not? Let's get us some Portuguese gibberish today instead of English gibberish. So we'll just put a paragraph or two of this in here. And when we're going through everything next week, we'll add some more stuff like tables and form elements and all this kind of stuff. So for the time being, I just kind of want us to see the difference that just a simple change makes. So we'll paste a couple paragraphs in there. We'll save this. We will run it with our live server. So let's open our live server here. And this is what our website looks like right now. Right? We haven't applied any styling rules to it. We have this H1, we have this H2, and we have a couple of paragraphs. So one of our big things to look at right now is just exactly what this looks like. Right? And we're about to see, just by the nature of one little copying and pasting, a big impact of Bootstrap. So I'm going to go back to my download Bootstrap page here. I'm going to copy this out of the CDN via JS Deliver. And I'm just going to paste that into the head of my website. Now, before I save, I want to bring back up the live site here, just so you can remember this is what this looks like now. Let's save. And now when we revisit that site, since it's on the live site, it's going to refresh automatically. When we revisit that site, when I pull it back up here, it'll be bootstrapized. So let's see what it looks like. Boom. Right? Just by the nature of pasting in those files from the CDN, we already see big differences here, right? Like for one, we have the fonts. The fonts are completely different. We're using sans serif fonts instead of our standard serif fonts that we use. And these aren't just a standard web serif font, but these are a custom sans serif font. You know, if we use our inspect tool, we can check these out and we can see the types of fonts they're using and such. Let's see if we can find it here. There's all sorts of rules here. Right, so we can see our sans serif font there. Looks like it uses... I'm not even going to, I'm not going to try to pronounce that, but it looks like it uses this font. As sort of its baseline font. For Windows computers. Which if we look at it there, compare it to here. Yeah, that's it, right? So we can see that. We see just based on the fact of how Bootstrap is handling the type here, we're seeing a big difference already in our site. Right? Just with one little implementation. And so that's a pretty big deal. Right? Pretty easy, pretty big deal. So as we look at that, we start to get these more. We start to get more of these ideas about what we can do with this. And we start to get to this idea of, well, what do we need to create a website with Bootstrap? And we already have our example there. But we do need to point out several of the things that are very important to getting ready to create a website with Bootstrap, because they're vital. Now, if we're doing kind of the things that we want to do, like if we let Visual Studio Code use that emit shortcut where we just hit one exclamation point and then we hit enter, then basically all of this prep work is going to be done for us as well. Right? For example, like one of the big things we need to do for the prep is we need to add our doc type. Right? If we're following our good rules and we are using and we're writing our HTML skeleton the way we're supposed to be, we should have that HTML5 doc type in there anyway. But Bootstrap does use HTML elements and CSS properties that require that HTML5 doc type. So we want to make sure we have that in there. Also, we want to make sure that we are including the language attribute in our HTML tag, which I believe both of these exist by default in our standard emit boilerplate that we get from just hitting exclamation point enter. Right? Obviously, we have our doc type here, and we have our lang equals English here. Wrong button. But those are kind of key to ensuring that, one, like we've got rules for like right to left to right, and all that kind of stuff built into Bootstrap. So if we make sure that we have that language attribute, it's going to know what the default is. And then again, we have some elements that require that HTML5 doc type. So we want to make sure that we have that HTML5 doc type as well. Now, other things to know here is that Bootstrap is mobile first. Right, so Bootstrap is designed to be responsive to mobile devices. Mobile first styles are core to the Bootstrap framework, right? When you think about it, I think we've mentioned it before, maybe in this class, maybe in other classes. Essentially, 80% of the entire world accesses the internet via a mobile device. So when the creators are kind of devising a plan to make the Bootstrap framework, well, they're going to do that with the mobile first strategy in mind. We're going to make this to be friendly to mobile first. And then from there, we're going to add our design elements and build our design system and all that kind of stuff. And so in order to do this, we do add the initial scale of the viewport in the meta information of our website header. Again, this is something else that is included by default in our emit boilerplate from Visual Studio Code. So again, if we're using that exclamation point enter emit boilerplate in Visual Studio Code, this is something else that we don't have to worry about. Right? If we're not using that, if we're writing our code in something else that doesn't have that boilerplate in it, we want to make sure that we include this data, because that's going to ensure proper rendering, and that's going to ensure the ability to do touch zooming on mobile devices. And so we see this meta tag here. Meta name equals viewport, content equals width, equals device width, comma, initial scale equals 1. And so the width equals device width part just sets the width of the page to follow the screen width of the device, which, since we're mobile first, we want to have that be kind of dynamic. So that's going to be highly dependent on the device. If you're using a mobile phone, it's going to be more narrow. If you're on a desktop monitor, it's going to be a lot wider. And the initial scale equals 1 part sets the initial zoom level when the page is first loaded by the browser. So it's going to start at that initial zoom level of 1. And we can see this in our document here as well. Right, if we zoom in to our head in this boilerplate, we can see here on my line 6 where we have this meta line included. So that's 3 bits so far that are included, and that's our doc, or that are kind of required. That's our doc type. That's our language attribute equals English, and the viewport for responsive settings. Another one that's I found to be more optional. Like, I've never really encountered a situation where I needed it, but it's also included in the Emmet boilerplate anyway, so we don't have to worry about it again if we're using that. And that's the character set. Setting that to UTF-8. Again, that's something that I haven't really had an issue with, right? But it's there, right? So these are the key elements that we need to make sure we have in there to continue using Bootstrap and having it render properly and have it being beautiful and all that kind of fun stuff that it's intended to be. Now, if we look at this site here that we generated by adding our CDN, we notice some things about it. Like, by default, one of the things that it's done is it's stripped out all the padding it's stripped out all the margin, I believe, is really all the padding, and some of them. It's reset the padding and the margin, is what I'm trying to say here. Margin's been reset to 0. If we look here in the inspect element tool, we see that margins have been reset to 0. We can see that our body element doesn't have any padding on it because it's right up against the side of our viewport window here. Right, we don't have any sort of breathing room between this. And that's kind of doing the same thing that we do, or we've done in demonstrations in the past, where we've said, okay, first what we want to do is we want to reset our margin, reset our padding, so we can kind of have this blank slate that we can build off of, right? And so we can make the customizations ourselves. And so really it's done for the same reason here in Bootstrap, right? We kind of when we first include our CDN information in here, we're kind of setting the site to this starting place. And from this starting place, we can start to build on it, right? And that's one of the big goals, is to be able to have a starting place that we can build on and do it quickly and easily. So from here, one of the next things that we would want to examine is the container, the idea of the container. So Bootstrap requires a containing element to wrap site contents, right? And if we're using best practices, we should be doing that anyway, right? Like every time, basically, whenever we're going to build a template, we build it with 3 different containers. We build it with a header container, we build it with a body container, or a main container rather. We build it with a header container, we build it with a main container, and we build it with a footer container. Right, and so each of these containers wrap our content here. And we have 2 basic container classes that we can work with in Bootstrap, right? This is CSS that's already written for us. We see we have a container class and we have a container-fluid class. And so our container class is a fixed width container, while our container fluid is a full width container that spans the entire viewport. Now, one of the key things to note here is that when we use these classes are not nestable. Right, we have one container for all the data that it contains. Right, which is why it's kind of important for us to establish things in that sort of way. With our different containers on our page to contain our different elements, right? Like we have that header container, we have that main container, and we have that footer container. We can have other, what we would call container elements within a container, but we can't give them one of these Bootstrap container classes. And so all of the CSS for these classes, it already exists, right? So all we really need to do is just add the class attribute to whatever element, to whatever container that we're adding it to get it to be instituted. So let's examine this. Right, we have two containers here that we have in use. That's our header, and that's our main. So let's go ahead and add to our header the class of container dash fluid. So it's a full width container. Now we haven't saved yet. Here's what it looks like before we save. Control S. Here's what it looks like after we save. Now there's a difference, but you might not notice it immediately. Right? The difference here is pretty subtle. Remember, before we added that class, there was no padding here. There was no visual separation between this W and the edge of our viewport. But now that we've added that class for a full width container, we can see that if we look at our box model, right, the container is still full width, and it's going to be full width regardless of how we do it. But now we have that little bit of padding there. So this is just a subtle difference. So let's just add the regular container property to our main here, right? And that's our fixed width container. Right, so we'll find our main. Let's zoom in there. We'll find our main. We'll add our class equals container here. Before we save, we'll remind ourselves of what it looked like before. We'll come back. We'll save. Now this is what it looks like now. Ooh. Our fixed width container is, kind of that stripe style, right? Like if we right click and inspect this and examine the box model sizing here, we can see that it is there in the middle. And we have this container centered up. Right now, even though we call it a fixed width container, it's still responsive, right? Like if I change my page size there, you see it responding. Now you see it responding at different breakpoints, right? So when we're talking about our fixed width container here, we're talking about our fixed width container in relation to media queries and various other things, because we see like how it just goes a little bit and jumps, goes a little bit and jumps, and those are typically what we see as breakpoints from media queries that have been utilized. But we have these breakpoints established by default. We don't have to think about them and write them. And, we're just centering up this element and making a nice looking site. Now from here, we can also write some customized CSS for this. Right? Like, we see our header here. Our header here is, pretty short. Right? We might want to make it larger. We might want to make our font size a little bit larger here. There are options that we might want to do. So we can add custom CSS to this. However, we are better off kind of using some of the elements that are already included in our Bootstrap. So I know we said we'd do this next week, but let's have a look at the documentation here. Right, let's go through some of this documentation. Let's look at the content section as we look at typography. right? So in our typography here, we see, like, oh, all of our headings have a default styling that our Bootstrap CSS provides them. And we get a look at that here. We see we can customize our headings to make a fancy heading or to make a little faded heading. Right, so maybe we want to take that second heading, our H2 that we have in our container here, and we want to follow what we've done here. We'll add a class of text-muted to get this faded secondary text that we see here. So all we'd have to do with that is add it into our H2 as a class attribute, save it. The CSS already exists. Now we have a muted element here. One of the things that I like to use for site titles are these display headings, right? To really make our headings stand apart. Right? We have these display headings that are a lot bigger, and I think they work really nicely for site titles. We also have something, I'm not sure if it's in this or in another. It might be in the layout. Jumbotron in the layout? Maybe. Maybe it might be in components. Yeah. We'll figure that out later. But we see we have different display sizes here. If we want a nice big display type, we can just add that to our H1. Right? So we can add to our H1 here. Class equals display-1. And that'll give us a nice big display font up at the top of our page. Right? So, ooh. This is actually starting to look really nice. Right? And we haven't really done anything with it yet. Right? We really haven't done anything at all with this. Right? We imported some files from a CDN, and then we added a few class attributes. And this is already starting to shape up, which is incredible. Right? So let's look back at some of our typography classes here that we can use, and let's see what else we have. Well, we have a lead paragraph here to make something stand out from another paragraph. So maybe we want this first paragraph here to be a lead paragraph. That'll make it slightly bigger than the other paragraphs. You know, it'll stand out a little bit more. So let's add that lead class here to that first paragraph. So that's class equals lead. Save that. Look at that. Pretty cool, right? Like that first paragraph is now a little bit bigger. It's in a slightly different font or a slightly lighter font. So we can kind of see it standing out, popping right out there. So this first paragraph, we're already drawing attention to it as being more important. We can look at some of the other stuff that we have here. We can mark text. We can make small text. We can make bold text. Utilizing different classes here. Very, very cool stuff. Let's have a look at Jumbotron, because Jumbotron's kind of cool. It used to be, like they used to have a class called Jumbotron in Bootstrap, but they dropped it in Bootstrap 5, it would appear. But now they have a Jumbotron example here to kind of create this custom Jumbotron. which makes things a little bit different. I actually didn't know that they had removed Jumbotron. That must have been an even more recent version, because they had it in Initial 5, but I guess maybe they removed it in 5.1 for breaking it. So that's interesting. We can look at, let's see, these components here are primarily JavaScript components, so that'll be something that we look at next week. I guess really the next thing for us to look at is our grid system. So we'll look at the grid system really quickly, and then we will we'll probably call it a day from there, right? And so we'll use this grid system to kind of change stuff up for us a little bit here. Maybe we should add ourselves another paragraph here. So let's add ourselves another paragraph below our second paragraph to kind of set ourselves up for success as we are approaching our grid system here. So where's my random text generator here? Let's grab another paragraph of gibberish and throw it in there. We'll save that. So now we have another paragraph of gibberish. Now let's talk quickly about the grid. So Bootstrap has a grid system in it that is based on a 12-column grid, right? So it's kind of automatically making these grid segments inside of whatever we create a grid in. If you don't want to use all 12 columns individually, you can group the columns together to create wider columns. All right, so we can see multiple examples here. Like if I have col-medium-12, that'll be 12 columns. We can do 6 and 6. We can do 4 and 8. We can do 4, 4, 4, and 4, 4, and 4. Right? We can have as many sets of columns in a single row that we like, but they always have to add up to 12, because in Bootstrap there are 12 columns across whatever we're putting in as a grid. Now Bootstrap's grid system is responsive. It's based on Flexbox as its basis, so the columns will automatically rearrange depending on the screen size. So we have, like you see that col-mid. There are different types of those. Right, we have col-xs, col-sm, col-mid, col-lg. And there is just a standard col that we can use as well. But we can consider these more dynamic and flexible kind of when we combine them and use them together. But we have this example here. Right, and this example is using just some structure. Right, so you can see here we create a row. And we often create a row with a div, because that div is a non-semantic tag, so we can take and subdivide our content in a page just by creating a row. And then inside of that row, we can create our columns just by adding the column class to whatever element. So the first thing we want to do is create a row, and then we add our desired number of columns with the column classes, and we should always add up to 12 with whatever those column numbers are. Right, so if we look at our site here, let's say I want to take these two paragraphs and put them side by side. Right, so let's do that. Let's create a row for these last two paragraphs. So in this instance, I can create a div and give it a class of row. And I've actually put this in the wrong place. This is not where I want it to be. I want it to be under this lead paragraph. So we have the lead paragraph and then two subparagraphs. That'll be side by side. So let's move that down there. And let's move that closing div tag down here. So now we have that row wrapping those paragraphs. So by default, having this row here doesn't do anything, right? Like if we save that and we go back and look, this is exactly the same. We need to add those column classes to our paragraphs. So this is class equals call dash md dash. So we have to add up whatever this number is. We have to add it up to 6. Since we're only doing 2 elements here, that's 12 divided by 2. That's 6 and 6. So I can make this a 6. And we'll do the same thing with this one. Class equals call dash md dash 6. We'll save that. Once we head back here, we'll see, oh, we've got 2 paragraphs side by side in our grid system here, which looks pretty nice. Right now, we see this second paragraph here is a little longer than this first paragraph. So if we kind of want to resize our paragraphs to maybe meet up, we can do that just by changing the numbers, right? The only thing that we need is for these numbers in the row to equal 12. So if I wanted to take and make that first row 5, or that first column and make that 5 and make the second column 7, I can do that, and that will make the first column just a little narrower than the second column. So that leaves me with something like this, which is pretty nice. Right? Very simple, very nice. We've done this with very little code, by the way. Right, and so when we look at our docs here, let's search our docs for height. And this is height for a progress bar. That's not what we want. Let's search our docs for height again. Doesn't look like we really have anything to set that, so we'll have to set that custom. But that's a good thing to wrap up with, is just showing how we can set something custom. Right, so in this instance, what I might want to do is just create myself another style sheet, right? We'll create myself another file here. We'll call it style.css. And we'll link it in our header here. We can just link it underneath our Bootstrap CSS link here, just so anything that we do in our CSS file will override anything that's in the Bootstrap CSS file, so it can be custom. Right, so this will be link href equals style.css, rel equals style sheet, type equals text/CSS, like that. Now we've added our own style sheet to this. So if we want to say make our header taller, right? Well, in our CSS, we can either add a new class for our top header, or we can focus one of the elements that already exists there. Like maybe we want to focus the header element, or maybe we want to write a new class, or maybe we want to write an ID. Right? So let's write a class just so we can see them work together. So I'll write a dot for a class here, and we'll call it main header, and we'll give it a height of, who's to say, we'll give it a height of 10 VW or 10 VH. A height of 10 viewport height, 10% of the viewport height. So we'll save this. When we're adding multiple CSS classes to a single attribute, we can just separate them with spaces. So just a space there. Main header is our class name. Main, capital H, header. We'll save that. And we'll look back here. And we'll see that it hasn't really done much. Right? It hasn't really changed much. And this is something that you'll find a lot. Right? So typically one of the things that we might have to do is we might have to add our important modifier to our CSS. So if we zoom in, we do exclamation important, and that will override anything that might be in conflict with it. So we might have to do that when we're writing custom CSS rules. And when we do that, this should be working. Let's try to figure out why it isn't. Oh, I know why it isn't. We put it in the wrong. We put it in the wrong container. That was fun to look at. So now we see it, and you might have saw it jump a little bit there after we saved the page. We can make that go a lot taller here. Let's jump it up to 30 so we get a lot of contrast here. Now we see that really jump there at that point. And let's remove our important here, even though it's good to have. And let's just see if it works just because we put it in the wrong place to begin with. We see that it still works without it because of the way that we have our style sheets laid out, to where it's gonna apply our Bootstrap CSS first, and then it's going to apply our custom CSS after. I don't know why I couldn't think of the word custom there. So one of the other things that we might want to do here, right, is like we see the content here. We might want to move the content to the bottom of that container, so we can just use some of the things that we know about our flex rules, right? Like we could say align content, I believe it is. Flex end. And since this is flexbox, it's just going to work like our flexbox works. Although I'm just kind of doing this one on the fly. Anyway, I think that's good enough for today. So we'll stop here. We'll fix that for next time. We'll talk about it more next time. Because that one we don't really need, because we were just kind of making that up as we went. Just to kind of do something cool there. But we'll have that figured out for the next session. All I just kind of wanted you to see here is just how quickly and easily we can make a nice looking site by doing just a little bit of code with our Bootstrap, right? And something that we might want to do just to make it look nicer here before we wrap up is we can align our text. We can want text. We can do text align center, right? And just align that there like that. So that's pretty nice. Maybe make that a little shorter. I don't know. Now we're just playing with it. Right, so with just a little bit of code and in just a few minutes, we took something that was basic and generic and boring, and we made it actually look kind of interesting and kind of nice. And that's one of our big goals for writing code with Bootstrap, right? And designing our sites with Bootstrap. Speed, ease, you can see that here. Right, so next week, we'll look some more at Bootstrap. We will examine more of the concepts around Bootstrap, and we'll look at a lot of the different individual components that you can find inside of Bootstrap. We'll look at how Bootstrap works with form elements, buttons, tables, all this other type of stuff. And we'll make an interesting looking website along with that. So that's all that I have for you for this week. We'll hang out in the chat for just a couple minutes, just in case anybody who's here with me live has any questions. But thank you for watching. We'll see you next time.